All right, so my name is Imar Quintanilla, and I've been assigned to Chapter 11, Organizational Communication. Let's get right into this. What exactly is organizational communication? Organizational communication is how people in the workplace speak with and share information with one another. So notice how I said speak with, not talk to or talk at. There's a big difference between speaking with someone or talking to someone or talking at someone. Talking to someone or talking at someone feels more like a lecture. It feels more like someone is being scolded. Talking with someone feels more like a collaboration. And I believe that talking with people breeds for a better, meaningful connection. And we all want that in the workplace because, we spend most of our time at work. That's the reality of it. And when we're at work, we don't want to be having a bad time because there's so many other things that we got going on in our life. And we want to make sure that we want to communicate effectively with one another. Easier said than done. So let's move on to the next one. Why does organizational communication matter? To me, it matters because these crucial conversations happen to everyone. And it happens randomly. You can never predict when this is going to happen. And it can happen with your job, it can happen with your relationships, it can happen with your friendships. And knowing how to maneuver, how to communicate your thoughts, your opinions in a way where it's clear, it's concise, is a skill. And I believe that practice does not make perfect. Practice makes permanent. And let me elaborate a little bit more with that. You could be practicing wrong, and you can do that for hours and hours and ingrain this into your system, but at the end of the day, it's still wrong. So it makes permanent. So this is a skill that all of us ought to acquire at some point in our lives because it's gonna it's gonna help us in our families in so many ways. So there are many types of organizational communications. Let's talk about the first one, upward communication. Now let's think about that. What is upward communication? Upward communication is when the employee speaks to the person who supersedes them. So a supervisor, a manager, and usually those conversations, they have a different type of tone. The tone is a little bit more formal, a little bit more professional. Whenever it is you're talking to your superiors, and I hate that word, but it is what it is. And when you're talking to your superiors and your bosses, you want to make sure you're presenting the best version of yourself where you keep it classy, you keep it professional. So upward communication is when employees speak with the higher ups. Now, there's a downward communication. Downward communication is when management speaks to employees. So it's a different shift of a mindset. And when managers speak to employees, they have to, I feel like they have to kind of walk on eggshells because nowadays everyone is so sensitive and there's always a power imbalance or people are looking for power imbalances. And it's kind of tricky how to be able to voice yourself, especially in the work environment and when you're on the clock. Another type of organizational communication is business communication. So, business communication is any form of communication that happens to in a work environment between employees and management. It happens between employees and customers or clients. So, business communication is kind of similar to upward communication. You want to be formal, you want to be professional, you want to keep it classy, and you want to make sure that the person at the receiving end has trust in you to do your job at the highest capability. Another type of organizational communication is the informal communication. This is the one like the everyday talk, the casual type of talk that happens in a work setting. So, I remember being I forget, like elementary school, we played a game and we would say, one person would say something to the person right next to them, and it would go be passed around all the students, and the person who is the last person to receive this message has to repeat out loud the what they heard, and you compare the original message versus the end message. Oftentimes it's very different because people find a way to add in some things off their own biases, or maybe they weren't listening too well, so they just repeated everything that they could remember on the spot. So informal communication is more the casual talk, and that's a good thing, but it also could be a bad thing because rumors spread, which brings me to my next point, and it's all about interpersonal communication skills. So interpersonal communication skills are the skills that determine how well you get along with others. And it's very layered, because there's body language, there's tone of voice, there's the use of your space or your proximity, how close you are to another person, how far you are from another person, like in distance, like it affects the message that you're trying to convey to the other person. And use of time. So let's break it down. I remember reading a book, and it was something about communication, and there was this I don't know how to say it, like there was this percentage breakdown of how communication works, and it said, I think it was 55% of it was body language, and then another percent of it was a tone of voice, and the other percentage was the message. So your body language is going to determine how you come off. If you're crossing your arms when you're coming up to someone and you're speaking real close to them, that's going to put people on guard. That's not going to make anyone feel comfortable with you. Do you really believe people are going to open up to you? No, they're not going to open up to you. They're going to feel like defensive. So got to be aware of your body language, and you don't want to be so confronting, and keep your distance. That's the proximity, the use of space. You don't want to be so close to someone because you're not trying to smell what they had for lunch. And your tone of voice, like how fast you speak. Are you sounding like you're condescending? Because that can cause a lot of problems at work if you're talking down to someone. It's kind of like the talking at, like I mentioned earlier. When you talk at someone or talk to someone, it's more of a lecture. But when you talk with someone, it feels like more of a collaboration. And I truly believe that it breeds more of a meaningful connection. And it's a skill. At the end of the day, it's a skill, and we have to practice it. And it's not easy, but a lot of people always kind of forget that these people skills are actually skills. So listening, there are different styles of listening. So let's break that down. There's a leisure listening. So leisure listening is people who listen only for words that demonstrate pleasure. So that the happy-go-lucky people who are listening to the things they like to hear. Inclusive listening is another form of listening, which is people who only listen to the main ideas of the conversation. Tell me what I need to know, and I'll move on with my life. Like I'm very much like that myself. There's a stylistic type of listening, which is people who listen to the way the information is presented. If you're a pretty sensitive person, nothing wrong with being sensitive. You're kind of attuned to like how people deliver their message. If you're a stylistic type of listener, if someone delivers the message way too aggressively, it's probably going to put you off, especially if you're not like that. And vice versa, if you're aggressive and someone's being too babying the audience and the message, it's gonna shut me out. I know I'm gonna be like, I don't want to listen to that. So another form of listening is a technical listening, and this is people who listen to the facts. And tell me the metrics. What can we observe that we can objectively observe and compare to see if this is doing us a service or this is doing us a disservice. Another form of listening is empathetic listening, and empathetic listeners are people who tend to speak with their feelings. And nothing wrong with speaking with your feelings. It's just that sometimes it lands and sometimes it doesn't, and you got to know your audience. And another form of listening is the non-conforming listeners. So the non-conforming listeners are the people who only listen to those they agree with. So, if a Democrat is talking to a Republican or a Republican is talking to a Democrat, there's like oil and water nowadays. And, like if I don't agree with you, it's sad, but I'm not this way, but because I choose to, listen to the differences more than I choose to listen to the similarities. So, non-conforming listeners, are people who only listen to those who they agree with. And I think that kind of works against the the people who are communicating, because it's only going to create division because we're not always going to agree with everyone. I struggle with this one personally right here is the amount of information that we give to other people. And, my mom, she's a social worker, and she calls this dosaging. And, not we all oftentimes assume that everyone is like us. People learn like how we learn, and that's not always the case. And for me, I'm a pretty intense person. I like information overload. It doesn't affect me. I want to know about that. So not everyone's like that, and sometimes I kind of get caught up in this, and I just give information overload, and it kind of gives people a little bit anxiety, and they don't retain the information. And when we communicate with another, we want to make sure that the message is retained with the other person. And dosaging, the amount of information that you give to them, it affects the way that it's received. And you got to read the room. So keep it leveled, not overloaded. Read the room. And most importantly, remember, it's not about you, it's about them. One rule that I kind of like to go, stick by is be more interested in the other person rather than being more interesting to the other person. That's kind of like a nice little baseline for me to kind of figure out who I need to be for the other person, and for the greater good of the situation. And at work we're dealing with different types of personalities. I work at Costco, and thousands of members we see every day. I can't just tell one coworker, straight up, because that may not be their temperament, and I have to know that. I have to know that, hey, this person seems a little bit anxious. This person seems like they kind of are walking on eggshells. So the last person I want to be is that intense dude, who's just hitting them with the raw facts, because they're not going to retain that information. And the last thing I want to talk about was tips for effective listening. Number one, stop talking. Like, it's so easy to talk, and most of the time we do more of the talking than the listening. And I think the connection really happens when we listen to one another, especially in a work environment. And you got to let the other person finish their thoughts. Interrupting them is not going to help you build a connection. At work, it's a team environment. And if we don't feel like we're a part of a team, or we're contributing to a team, or someone is contributing to our team, that person gets black sheeped. And I can understand that, but at the same time, like, let's not count them out. Let's give them a chance, but we got to do our part in being able to, supplement whatever it is that they may be missing. You know, ask questions. I've always been told that whenever you ask why, it puts kind of people on defense. But when you ask what questions, people, tend to open up to you and you get to the root of the issue a little bit more quicker than asking why. And you gotta remove and resist the distractions. There's so many things happening around us, and it's easy to be distracted. And you gotta make time for this. So find a quiet room and you know do your prep work to be able to present your information in a way based off of the temperament of the person at the receiving end. And like I said, people skills are a skills. We often think that skills are always, something like coding, being able to be a carpenter. Those are all skills for sure, but people skills are a skill. So, that's my interpretation of chapter 11 of organizational communication. And I hope that all made sense. You guys have a good one. Thank you.